The feast we're celebrating, things could have been very different. They invited Jesus to the marriage and the 7 keys. Those are the 4 things on my mind this weekend as we gather together. First, the feast we're celebrating. So we're still in what the church calls the octave of Christmas, which is to say, technically speaking, today's still Christmas Day. That's because you can't possibly exhaust in a single day the thanksgiving that God is deserving of in having become man to rescue you and me from the powers of sin and death. And so the church is always trying to teach us, even though many of us probably don't think this way, how to celebrate. The church knows how to celebrate. And so for 8 days long, we celebrate this great occasion when you and I were freed from captivity to Satan's power. And in this octave of Christmas, we always call to mind, usually at the end, what we celebrate today, the Feast of the Holy Family, which is an occasion for the church to remind us that God didn't just become a man and walk amongst us in some sort of solitary life. He embedded into every aspect of our life except sin. So he's born of a woman. He's obedient. God is to his mom and to Joseph, his foster father. He has to learn to speak. He plays with other children. He gets hurt. He has to choose to forgive. He has drama in his family, the likes of which few of us can actually relate to. Just read the gospel narratives early on and you'll see. He grows in wisdom, learns a trade, and so much more. And like many of you, perhaps, as we celebrate the Feast of the Holy Family, I find myself reflecting on my own family in these days. So as I mentioned on Christmas Eve, this has been a rather odd Christmas for me and for my sisters, since it's the first Christmas that we're celebrating as orphans. I don't like it, to be honest with you. I know as I look out at you, there's a lot of you who know the same feeling. It leaves a massive hole. My sisters, or at least 2 of us, or 2 of them and myself, were able to get together for a brief, and I mean brief, moment on Christmas Day. And as almost always happens when we get together, we just tell stories about our mom and dad to each other. Whenever we're together, that's all we do. We just talk about them and thank God for them and say to each other, how is it, at least with regards to parents, that we were blessed enough to win the lottery? I've mentioned countless times over almost 12 years now here the simple fact that I've never met 2 greater people than my mom and my dad. I won't bore you with all the details again here this afternoon. I'll simply say this. The best description I ever heard of their marriage came at my dad's funeral. We were at Holy Name Church in Birmingham. Everybody was seated except for my 3 sisters and my brother, who was still there at the time, and my mom, who was in her wheelchair. And my mom looked at my dad lying in that box, and through tears, she said words I will never forget hearing. She looked at him and said, "Because of you, honey, I know who God is." But it wasn't always that way. My mom and dad could have turned out very different than they did. They weren't great when they began their marriage, not by a long shot. Like every couple that enters into marriage, they had baggage, and they had a lot of baggage. My mom and dad both experienced traumas. My mom's trauma in a most particular way was the divorce that her parents went through when she was in high school. When my grandfather, her dad, quite literally walked out of the house one day and never came back, had an affair with and married his secretary. It was front page news at the time for many weeks and months because of my grandfather's career. It left a massive hole in my mother. She felt rejected, and perhaps even worse, she felt unlovable. There are many in our congregation, I know, especially women who've gone through that pain and know it. The result of which was my mom became beyond bitter towards my grandfather. She despised him and didn't talk to him for years. Thanks be to God, by God's grace, tremendous healing happened in their lives. And at the end of my grandfather's life, my mom was the one who ended up caring for him most of his last days. And it was wondrous to behold, but that's not at all how my mom entered into marriage. My dad, on his part, entered into marriage with the baggage that comes from being a veteran. He was in World War II. And he entered in with the trauma and the wounds, which only a soldier who's been at war can understand and relate to. These things became the raw material, if you will, for problems to emerge. Big problems. But they also became the raw material for God to move in and to do something. I'm not going to go into any detail. I'll save that to my mom and dad to share with you when we get to heaven and are all together. I'll just tell you this, that very early on in my mom and dad's marriage, they almost quit. They went through a massive trial. And they were that close to getting a divorce. I don't know whether or not my mom and dad made a conscious decision to invite them into the wedding, but they made it a conscious decision to do something else. In these days of Christmas, the church encourages us to reflect not just on the birth of Jesus, but on those other early mysteries of his life, including his first miracle, the wedding at Cana, where he manifests himself in his glory and turns 180 gallons of water into wine. And St. John in that gospel says this, that Jesus and his disciples were also invited to the wedding. Like I mentioned, I'm not sure if my mom and dad invited him to the wedding, but I do know that in the middle of that trial, when they were that close to getting a divorce, they made a very conscious decision to invite him to the marriage. And because they did, I'm here. And I got a story to tell. But if they hadn't, I wouldn't be here. And there would be no story to tell. But here's the key, or the keys. If I were to ask my mom and dad, or if you were to encounter my mom and dad and say, how did you do this for 66 years, 70 years of a relationship, 4 years of dating before they got married? How did you go from a couple that was on the verge of divorce and about to split to a couple that ended up mentoring hundreds and hundreds of other couples who came to the house, called, stopped by, asked to spend time with them? How did this happen? My dad wouldn't say, oh, I don't know. I guess we just lucked out. No one stumbles into greatness in anything. It takes grace, that is to say God's power, and hard work. The grace is always being offered to us. In my case anyway, I just know it's the hard work that's often lacking. But my mom and dad would say that they came to realize there were 7 essential keys to enabling a marriage to thrive. They were the reason why they became what they became. And I've shared these 7 keys on several different occasions with couples who've gotten married here or elsewhere since my dad's death. And almost every time I do this, couples come up to me afterwards, usually older couples, and go, will you write those down for us? It's happened all morning today. And so since I get asked to share these all the time, I can't think of anything better to do on the Feast of Holy Family than to share my mom and dad's 7 keys to a thriving marriage. So here they are. First, build your marriage on self-sacrifice. My mom and dad were married at St. Peter and Paul in 1950, the Jesuit church downtown in Detroit, at a side chapel because my mom wasn't Catholic. So it wasn't a mass, and at the time back then, some of you might remember this, the priest used to read a rather sober exhortation to the couple. I mean, like really sober. And I don't know how they remembered this, but somehow they did. They latched on to one line in particular in this exhortation, which, as I grew up together with my brother and my sisters, they used to pound into our heads. The line goes like this: sacrifice is always tedious and irksome. Love can make it bearable, but perfect love makes sacrifice a joy. We saw them do that, and we learned by watching them that that's what's at the heart of love, whether it's a married life or a priestly life. To love is to give, and to give is to sacrifice. Second, anticipate things getting better. Not easier, better. Those of you who are married know this better than me. Trials come, storms come. In some cases, disaster comes. But if you make the conscious choice to invite God into all of that, and you weather the storm and the trial and the disaster, well, then you have the grace of experiencing, no matter what happens, we can endure this because God is faithful and He will give us what we need, and so you grow. My mom wrote to my dad on their 65th wedding anniversary in a card that we found after he died. How is it possible that after 65 years, I love you more now than I did on the day that we married? But I do. Third key: never, ever, ever keep score. Everybody in here is competitive. My mom and dad were hyper competitive. I'm more competitive than anybody I know. If you're competitive in marriage, you lose. Fourth, and related to that, forgive everything immediately, no matter what. Fifth, if God blesses you with children, remember what children most need. And what children most need is not to know that you love them, it's to know you love each other. When a son or a daughter knows that his or her mom and dad love each other, they're safe. And if they're safe, life is great. When they don't know that, life is messy as all get out, and problems emerge like crazy. Many of us in here know that. I can remember the one time that my mom and dad seriously went at it when I was in high school, and I was a wreck for weeks because I thought they were going to split, and I couldn't fathom what life would be like in a house without my mom and dad. Sixth, model the faith. This is especially true for fathers, and this is especially true for fathers with sons. Children are mimics. You know that better than me. They will say what they hear you say, and they will do what they see you do. My dad was CEO of a Fortune 50 company. I saw him go to Mass every single morning, and I saw him on his knees every night before he went to bed, at the foot of his bed praying. And just by watching him, I learned, I guess that's what a man does. My dad didn't need a crutch. He had all the money in the world. So I knew faith wasn't about a crutch. I just learned by observing him, a real man prays. So I did what every little boy does. I modeled my dad. I started to pray on my knees at the bed before I went to bed. Their bedroom was at the end of a long hallway. And I don't know if he left the door open intentionally for us to see it. I think he did. It wasn't open the whole night, but it was open before he went to bed so that we would observe him doing that. And it taught us an invaluable lesson. And seventh and finally, don't ever forget the point of marriage. And increasingly so, I think there's one single point to marriage. Marriage is a sacrament. A sacrament is a sign. It's something you can see that points to something else. If you're married, the sign is you. Not you as a couple, first and foremost. You as wife, or you as husband. And who you point to is God. And may your wife or your husband, when you're lying in that box, say to you the words my mom said to my dad. Because of you, Ken, I know God. No one's got the perfect marriage. There's no perfect priest either. We're all works in progress. But we can always keep improving and getting better. And best practices help us to get better. These are my mom and dad's 7 best practices. New Year's is quickly upon us, and with New Year's comes time for resolutions. And if you're married and have a family, I can't think of a better resolution to adopt than one that has to do with your marriage or with your family. No matter where you might be, when you walked into this church this afternoon, Christmas tells us God breaks in. He acts. He rescues, he saves, he does dramatic things for us and for you and for me. He broke into my mom's life, he broke into my dad's life, and he changed everything as a result of it. All because they made a conscious choice to invite him in. Maybe that's the resolution that some of us should consider making this year like never before, to invite Jesus into the marriage. But no matter what the resolution you might make this year, if you're married, I want to tell you very sincerely, here's my daily prayer for every family in this parish until I leave here at the end of June this year. I pray that your children will talk about you, honor you, thank God for you, and tell stories about you. The way my sisters and I talk about, honor, thank God, and tell stories for our mom and dad. May 2019 be a year rich with God's grace for our marriages and our families.